Hi everyone. Today I am going to talk about The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah. Pretty recent book. I think it was 2018 that it was published. So that'll make it about 100 years newer than anything I've reviewed so far. Received a lot of positive attention in the media, and there are actually plenty of other reviews on YouTube, which I've watched many of them and will refer to a few of them that I found interesting. Kristin Hannah has written quite a few novels. I've never read any of the other ones she's written, although she recently wrote The Nightingale, which was a popular one. So most of this review I'm going to do in a spoiler-free manner, just talking about general, what I liked about the book and what I didn't like so much. And then after that, I'm going to go into a spoiler-filled section, and I'll give a warning before I move on to that part. Now, this is one book that you can judge by its cover. So it's apparent from the start of this book that there's a certain atmosphere, and the cover really conveys that mood and the setting. So in many ways, this book it's a mood book. It definitely conveys certain emotions. And Alaska is a beautiful setting, but even in the best moments, like the summer in Alaska, there are always harsher moments around the corner. So there's always a little bit of this sense that everything is fleeting, that almost a wistfulness, like knowing that what you have right now isn't going to last forever, so you have to appreciate it while it's there. And this goes with several emotions that permeate throughout the book. There are themes of loneliness, of fear. There's this sort of ephemeral beauty of the environment of Alaska and of events that happen in our lives, and sort of this harsh unpredictability where you just have to be ready for anything that could happen. Here, Kristin Hannah has told an interesting story with some difficult dilemmas and several interesting themes. But I personally found that the way she tells it and the way she reveals her characters often lacks subtlety and could be done better. This isn't a novel that made me think enormously, which is not necessarily a bad thing, although there were some important themes in it that did stand out to me. One of those is domestic abuse, which is pretty evident from the start, so not really a spoiler or anything. And something you should be warned of before starting this book. So overall, I thought this book was okay. I waffled for a bit on whether I would give this book 2 or 3 stars out of 5. In the end, I settled on 3, although I'd put it on the level of books where I wouldn't dissuade you from reading it if you're interested, but also it's not the kind where I would directly recommend it to someone. So Kristin Hannah's writing and storytelling is something I found excellent at times, but other times not so much. It was the better moments, though, that bumped it up to 3 stars for me. So the book is set in Alaska. The family of the main character, Leni, moves there in the first few chapters. Their dad has been given some land there, and he has a very romantic view of what it's going to be like there that we are quick to learn is not really going to be what the reality is. In some ways, this book definitely evokes a memory of Call of the Wild by Jack London, which is actually a book that the main character Leni is reading in the first chapter or 2 before her family goes to Alaska to learn a little bit more about the environment. Another book that this definitely reminded me of was Into the Wild, which I read earlier this year. This is a true story of a college-age boy who I think in the 90s went off to Alaska to live and survive in the bush and found himself in way over his head. So this romantic idea of Alaska as simultaneously a harsh and unforgiving place, but also a beautiful place, a place to get away from the rest of the world, is not anything particularly new. But despite this concept not being terribly original, the way Kristin Hannah paints this picture of Alaska is pretty strong, and definitely gives us the feeling of being there in Alaska, and the way that she describes the scenery and the local wildlife and just the dangers of being there, but also the beauty of being there. That said, I do think at times it's a little bit overdone. Towards the beginning of the book, when we're being introduced to the Alaskan environment, I think it goes on too long, and we hear a lot of times that the days are really long. Dad went out and worked all day, which, by the way, was really long. Leni woke up as soon as the sun came out, which was super early. A lot of these things are necessary descriptions, but only once. And I think that is a flaw of the writing style that is present in other areas as well. In one of the other YouTube videos I watched on the Alex Black Reads channel, I'll link that below, she commented that A plus B equals C, and we know A plus B, like the author doesn't really have to tell us that C is also true. We need to be able to draw some of these inferences for ourselves. And maybe we will miss some of these things, but that's okay because we'll feel more like our perceptions are our own instead of just the author's perceptions. I think also the extent to which the environment is unforgiving is quite in your face at the beginning of the book. Every character we meet is immediately proclaiming these fears of winter as soon as we arrive. I know it's true that the winter is harsh, but it doesn't seem like the first thing that you're going to say as soon as you meet your new neighbor. We also keep hearing the narrator surprised at how many of the people are carrying guns with them, which I guess is believable for a 13-year-old who's been living in Seattle to think. But I feel like this also comes across a little bit heavy-handed, like cueing in the readers of how dangerous this place is and how alarming that is to see guns all over the place. And I personally was just kind of thinking, yeah, I mean, it's Alaska, it's the 1970s, it's dangerous, and yeah, you're absolutely going to need a gun. So let's just get on with the story. And sometimes also the way the characters are perceiving the environment feels a bit naive. Like for Leni's mother, Cora, a fully grown woman who has certainly heard of Alaska, and also for Leni herself, who's read Call of the Wild, sometimes the reactions she has to some of the things that are different about Alaska feel a little bit like she's reacting on behalf of the reader instead of on behalf of herself. And that brings me a little bit more to talk about the characters. The characters and the dynamics between them were hit or miss for me. I don't think any of the characters themselves were a complete miss for me, but sometimes the dynamics between them and some of the ways that the characters behaved in certain situations or the way that they developed throughout the novel didn't quite work or seem believable for me. The plot was not too bad either, and I won't go into the details about that right now, but the book did have a sense of progression. Sometimes the things that happen in the book felt a little bit artificial for the sake of drawing out the plot and making almost as if it was written to reach a certain page length. I feel like the book could have been a lot shorter. The ending could have happened quite a bit sooner, with maybe just a brief epilogue or final chapter to resolve everything up. And in terms of diversity and representation, there's not much. Yes, there are a few non-white characters, but their character development, if you could even call it development, is really no different than the other characters. And we don't really see the extent to which these identities play any role in their life experiences. In particular, there's one black character referred to as Large Marge, who is kind of just the stereotype of the strong black woman. And she's an admirable character, but we don't really learn too much about her. And I was a little bit disappointed about that. I feel like she must have had a backstory and a reason for being in Alaska that was much richer than the story that we're actually given. It's also mentioned a few times that some of the characters are natives, but again, we don't really learn anything special about these characters. It just kind of said, oh, the teacher of the schoolhouse was a native woman, and that's kind of that. Now, granted, these weren't what I would call poor representations necessarily, but definitely something to keep in mind if you're looking for a little bit more diversity in your reading. One thing for me that made this novel a little bit challenging to get into is the main character, Leni. This is a sort of a coming-of-age novel, I would argue, and Leni goes through some realistic emotions, but I also found her one of the less believable characters, and we see everything through her eyes. But to me, it never really felt like I was seeing everything through the eyes of a 13-year-old girl. It felt to me like the author's voice always remained present. And I felt like sometimes Leni was being used as a tool to convey things that the author wanted the readers to think instead of as an actual living and growing character in herself. For one thing, I thought that Leni was far too mature for a 13-year-old girl. I'm not trying to imply that I think all 13-year-old girls are completely immature. I think they can be mature in plenty of ways, but I also felt like this, in my mind, made it harder to really see Leni grow and learn throughout the novel. She also seemed to have certain awareness of the world that seemed more important for conveying to us the time and place of the novel than actually being relevant to her character at all. Some people have called this novel historical fiction, but for me, it's not really historical fiction, or if it is, it's barely so. And sometimes these events are forced on us through Leni in a way that seems like it was intended to make it more like a historical fiction novel, but seem completely unnatural. For example, when I was listening to the audiobook, there was one point that I bookmarked it because it was just so egregious. So Leni is watching another character, a grown man, and his college-age daughter is trying to comfort him at a time when he is distressed. And this description we hear at this point is that The man's daughter placed her hands on his shoulders and led him away, like the Secret Service escorting away Nixon. I thought, not only is that a reference that is completely inappropriate for the context of the event that we're actually witnessing right now, this is just not something that Leni would have been thinking about at all. We see no indication earlier in the book that Leni is particularly aware or cares much about the political situation in the U.S., which made this for me a rather jarring statement that wrenched me out of the character's mind and back into the author's mind. And similarly, sometimes Leni comes to these realizations about the world after a particular traumatic or difficult event that she goes through. And these realizations are almost immediate. They seem far too abrupt and frankly too developed and mature for a 13-year-old girl. It's not that I don't think she could come to these conclusions, but the fact that she processes them almost instantaneously and the sort of grandiose way in which she phrases these conclusions make it feel like the author speaking through the character instead of the character realizing and learning for herself. And this is a shame because a lot of the book is about the main character growing and processing and learning through the things that she experiences and the environment around her. But a lot of this just seems to get distilled into sort of trite remarks such as she realized that the world was a lot more dangerous on the inside than the outside. And I think this is one of those cases where every reader would have drawn the same conclusion without Leni having to say it explicitly. Okay, so that's about all I can say without giving a little bit more away about the ending. So I'm going to get into the spoilers now. So now's your time to jump off if you just wanted to get the spoiler-free summary. Leni's mother, Cora, I felt like is one of the stronger written characters because she is a complicated character. She does a lot of things that seem rather irrational, but we come to understand throughout the book just how conflicted she is and why she does some of these things that maybe weren't what Leni would have expected her to do in the first place. And one of the strongest aspects of this book, I think, is Leni's growth in the sense of coming to understand a little bit more why her mother is and behaves the way she does, and being able to see this behavior as not purely a fault, but also as something that's complicated and ultimately understandable. Leni's father, on the other hand, I was a little bit disappointed with as a character. We understand from the very start of the novel that he is someone who struggles with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, although I'm not sure it would have been called that or understood at the time, and also with alcohol abuse. And these factors also seem to aggravate a sort of paranoia about basically everything that he's had since he returned from some violent experiences in Vietnam. Now, at the start of the novel, I thought that Leni's father, Ernt, was going to be a more sympathetic and complicated character, but unfortunately he ends up being a little bit more one-dimensional than I had hoped at the beginning of the novel. And this was kind of a disappointment because it feels as if his PTSD and his paranoia and just his experiences in the war are used kind of as a vague explanation for everything that he does after the war, but not in a way that truly allows us to understand him. So I would imagine that someone who actually has struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder or has a loved one who has struggled with trauma will find this portrayal of Ernt as unsatisfying and maybe even frustrating, as I saw in one of the top reviews on Goodreads. As an aside, the character of Ernt reminded me a lot of Tara Westover's father in her novel Educated, which is admittedly not too surprising because I listened to audiobooks of both of them and they're narrated by the same character in a pretty similar voice. And in fact, there were some other parallels between that novel and this one, and that's one that I recommend checking out if you get a chance. The best aspect of Ernt's character, in my opinion, is an aspect that's explored only very briefly, which is the idea of, does he truly love his family in some sense? Or is he so obsessed and paranoid that it's basically destroyed any ability to truly love someone at this point in his development? I like this idea that there can be sort of a fine line between loving someone and starting to feel obsessed or possessive or paranoid in a way that actually destroys the essence of love and wishing well for other human beings. Unfortunately, this is a topic that I found was undermined as the novel goes on, eventually leading, of course, to the point where his wife murders him, and this action is largely portrayed as justified because he's no longer a sympathetic character whatsoever. I did find that the relationship between Leni's mother and father was one of the more realistic relationships portrayed in the book, and perhaps an accurate portrayal of what it might look like to be in a relationship involving domestic violence and abuse. This is part of why I really liked Leni's mother as a character, because you could really feel the conflict in her that's brought about by this idea of she loves this man and who he used to be and who she thinks he might be again, so much that she's willing to believe promises that are really empty promises and that Leni is quick to see through. Yet for me, while this was frustrating, it also felt totally understandable. She feels powerless and she is afraid of what could happen, especially in this dangerous external environment that she's living in right now. And in fact, we see that several of her attempts to escape are thwarted by the external environment and the circumstances around them. So as readers, we feel this frustration and we feel trapped. We desperately want her to be able to escape her abusive husband, and maybe sometimes the plot does make Cora a little bit more powerless than she really is, but at the same time we understand why she is afraid, and we can see that even for Leni's actions of defiance, her mother has to pay a steep price. On the other hand, we had Leni's relationship with Matthew, which for me was unfortunately pretty disappointing. I never felt like I could really believe their relationship or even their friendship. I think part of this is because Leni meets Matthew on the first day of school, and suddenly it feels like they're best friends, and the next day they're skipping school. After a few days of knowing each other, they're such good friends that it's genuinely difficult for them to spend the whole coming summer apart from one another. The one scene between Leni and Matthew that I actually did sort of feel something for was when Leni is trying to talk with Matthew after his mother has died, and he's by the river, and he sort of seems to have maybe a flashback where he remembers what it was like to see his mother die in the river in front of him. And the way that he reacts and sort of lashes out at Leni feels very harsh, but also very human. And I think that that was one thing that we were kind of lacking at some of the other scenes between Leni and Matthew. They just didn't really have the vulnerability or the humanity. In that particular scene, I did get sort of this sense of Matthew not only going through grief, but feeling like as a boy growing into a man, like he's not really allowed to feel grief. And like that would make him less of a person and make him a loser, in his own words. I thought that was really powerful, and that particular scene really made me feel sad. And although some have pointed out, rightly so, that many of these scenes are kind of melodramatic, and that scene may have been kind of engineered to be a tearjerker kind of scene as well, I did think that that one worked for me, and I wish that more of the scenes in the book that were supposed to be intentionally emotional had a little bit more of this depth to them, instead of kind of just the cliche things that teenagers in love for the first time are supposed to say to one another. And one idea that I found interesting, raised by Alex Black Reads, a channel that I've linked below, is the idea that for much of the novel, this was not portrayed as necessarily a positive relationship. In fact, we see many ways in which, in its suddenness and the almost blind faith that the two of them have in one another, that almost seems out of desperation to be accepted rather than a true appreciation or understanding of the other person, this relationship seems as if it could take a turn for the worse and essentially become almost the exact relationship that Leni's parents had. Unfortunately, this possibility is never really addressed or put to rest. The language that Leni and Matthew use to describe one another feels much more like infatuation than any genuine concern for one another, and therefore the way that the book ends feels a little bit too convenient and out of character, and in my opinion does gloss over some of the more problematic aspects of Leni and Matthew's relationship, especially because Leni at age 13 is portrayed to be a character mature beyond her years. It was quite surprising to me that 4 years later, this guy who she knew, who admittedly was her only friend, but also who she hasn't seen for 4 years, has suddenly become such a compelling force that she can't even wait a few more weeks to be with him at college, and instead has to risk everything, including her mother's health and safety, just to be with this boy for one afternoon. Now, I'm not saying this isn't a mistake that would be realistic for a character of Leni's age to make, but given what we know about her as a character and what she's seen in her parents' relationship, it seems almost absurd for her to behave in this way, especially because it's not like it's really that much of a sacrifice for her to wait a few more weeks until she's off to college with Matthew. Now, there are a few other interesting characters who unfortunately also usually fell pretty cleanly into the good guy or the bad guy prototype, and therefore I felt like we didn't really get to explore their complexity as much as I would have liked. One of those characters is Mad Earl, who is kind of a crazy conspiracy theorist and has a very negative influence on Leni's father, Ernt. Mad Earl kind of just falls into the stereotype of your wacko rural conspiracy theorist who moved to Alaska to get away from the government and the communists and blah, blah, blah. And although this is certainly a kind of character who can exist, we really didn't get to see much of how he became this way, other than a few casual comments at his funeral. There are a few other characters who I think are almost too good of characters, like they have very few flaws. One of those is Tom Walker. So Tom Walker is kind of the arch nemesis of Leni's father, Ernt, but not because he really did anything at all or wanted to be a nemesis, but just because Ernt is super paranoid and he thinks that there's something going on between his own wife and Tom. His only flaw is that he's wealthy and he is privileged, but he always behaves in a really admirable way. It's not clear that there's much conflict with him at all, in spite of all the insinuations by Ernt that he's like trying to seduce Leni's mother. Even if he is a little bit attracted to Cora, there's never any evidence that he would let that actually get in the way, in spite of him being very clear that he disapproves of the way that Ernt treats his wife and also his daughter, Leni. So Tom exists basically as a sort of savior character. We also have large Marge, who is welcoming to the family from the very first moment they set feet in the town. Frankly, she also is pretty much a perfect character with no obvious flaws. Everything she does seems justifiable, and she doesn't really seem to run into any conflicts. Really, the only conflict she encounters is that she seems reluctant to interfere with Cora and protect her in a way that is against Cora's own wishes. So these characters, I felt, we never really encounter their flaws that make them more human. And in looking for a bunch of other reviews for this book on YouTube, one question that kind of came up is this book primarily for a woman audience? And I think that any book should really be for anyone, regardless of who it was written for as a primary audience. So definitely anyone is okay with reading whatever they want. But being a book that is written by a woman author and that really addresses some heavy issues about experiences that women go through, with several prominent women main characters, is this the kind of a book that would appeal less to men? And I would have to say mostly no. I feel like when a book is excessively emotional, that seems to detract men more than it detracts women. I didn't feel like that was a crucial enough part of the book to make it anything that I would think would be a deterrent for men to read this book. And I especially don't think that just because it's written by a woman author and it features women characters who go through women's issues, I definitely don't think that that should be something that deters men, although admittedly it does sometimes. I wouldn't really say this book is obviously more suitable for men or for women. I think both would potentially enjoy it. And one other thing that I really didn't like that much was towards the end of the book, or really towards the middle, we start seeing short point of view sections from characters other than Leni. And Leni is the main character. I think we can understand the other characters through her. I don't think that it's necessary to have point of view from the other characters. Every so often getting a point of view from Matthew just to kind of remind us how much he cares about Leni as well, which is something that frankly I would have been happier if it was just left a little bit more ambiguous. And seeing a point of view from Cora at the end was really not that helpful. I didn't really need to see the specifics of at what point and from what illness Cora died. It felt like merely just a plot device to make people sad and give Leni an opportunity to turn back on her commitment to never see Matthew again and go and see him. And then that leads into the final aspect of the book, a scene that seems like the only reason why we had an extra 2 or 3 hours on the end of the book after the murder scene in the escape, and that is the reunion of Leni and Matthew. I found it frustrating because I didn't find it that powerful. I was frustrated when Matthew found himself getting angry that Leni might have married someone else, even though it was a mistake. I thought that is kind of a warning sign that that he is in some ways just as possessive and insecure as Leni's own father was. But that's a possibility that is explicitly removed by the author with the whole epilogue thing. And I also felt like the way that Matthew kind of appears to be almost brain dead, and then after seeing Leni, just sort of returns to himself and is almost like a normal person who just has a little bit of trouble moving around and stuff. And then, of course, we learn from his father that even though beforehand Matthew's father was making it sound like everything was really, really bad and he was completely not the same, afterwards, his father says, oh, he actually hasn't been that bad. And that felt like a cheap bit of suspense that was being put in. And frankly, a little bit unsatisfying, because the message up to that point seemed to be that Leni loved Matthew regardless of everything, and that even though he was not the same person he used to be, and obviously would never be the same person again, that was something that she was going to have to live with, and a consequence of her somewhat foolish actions in running away. Instead of seeing Leni learn a real lesson, by the end of the story, we basically see her just get off the hook for making similar mistakes to the ones that her mother made. She doesn't really realize ever just how lucky she got to be in the situation that she's in. And Matthew being fundamentally the same person now, despite some minor changes in his cognitive abilities, seems to simply underscore this sense that there's no real consequence for her actions. Now, maybe it sounds like I'm being hard on Matthew. I mean, I certainly wasn't wishing for him to be worse off, but leading up to the ending, we had all these problems projected, and then in the last few pages, it's just all glossed over and wrapped up in a way that makes it really excessively uplifting and gives you a sense of everything's going to be okay for a novel where that doesn't seem to have been the overall message and was not one of the things that I took away from it. And one other thing that was kind of interesting to me in how everything resolved with Ernt's character is we have this character who is, on one hand, sees the beauty of Alaska, but is also extremely paranoid, in some ways in sort of a survivalist mentality of he needs to be ready for these terrible things to happen. And in the end, terrible things do happen, some of them caused by him in the first place, but some of the things that actually happen are things that never really could have been predicted. Like, no one would have predicted that Matthew was going to have brain damage. Leni wouldn't have predicted that her mother was going to end up killing her father and they'd have to flee the state and basically get new identities. So in one of the, in my opinion, stronger themes of this novel, we see a common thread of loneliness and fear and worry about how things might turn bad and go awry. And for many of the characters, there are very specific things that they're afraid of. And then in the end, bad things do happen, but they're not things that any of the characters could have been prepared for. And even if they had seen them coming, fearing for these things wouldn't have necessarily made them any better. So that's a wrap for this review of The Great Alone by Kristin Hannah. In summary, it wasn't one of my favorite books, but there were aspects of it that were beautiful enough, especially the descriptions of Alaska, that I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. It's been interesting seeing what others have thought about this book, especially since it's been a while since it was released, so there are plenty of opinions out there. And I've linked just a couple of my favorite YouTube reviews below, and if you had a strong opinion about this book, I'm definitely curious to hear what you thought, so leave a message in the comments and let me know what you thought. Bye, and happy reading.